it as a way of life for the Black community. So I found my way to this space. As I said, I'm an ag attorney, and so I work for a nonprofit called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, which is an organization that it's a 67-year-old nonprofit. It was founded by 22 cooperatives in 9 southern states, currently chartered in 17, and so it's a organization of Black farmers, landowners, and cooperatives. And I just think about the history of ag in this country, and I see the work that the Federation has done and how it impacts the communities. And so for myself, as the director of the Agricultural Law Institute, I think the way that we can help is, one, by pushing the cooperative model. I think back to when I was a law student. I did graduate from Southern Law Center. We were taught traditional business entities. Cooperatives was not something that was introduced to us, so I think that it starts there. And then also, again, providing those services to the community. And so, we have clinics, and so I know some of the other schools already have clinics that focus on cooperatives, but I think just educating students so that when they graduate and they become licensed attorneys, that they don't just focus on traditional business entities, but that they also advise, the community of cooperatives, and that they are aware and able to provide those services.
So, before, I talk about sort of HBCUs, I think, Evan, as you were talking about the Federation, I just remember as a young person, I got a chance to volunteer with the Federation, right? And so the notion of cooperatives was fundamental to thinking about sort of Black economic development, thinking about sort of Black politics. At the same time, I would, as a young person working with 21st century youth leadership movement out of Selma, with Sister Malika, Sister Mama Rose, who calls herself Mama Faya now. Cooperatives were always sort of part of sort of our education of like what we needed to do as sort of part of Black liberation, Black community economic development. And as an undergraduate, right, I sort of had a chance to work, and I saw Sister Alita here, who I haven't seen in like years, right? And so that space sort of cultivated in me sort of to think about like what does it mean sort of to build our communities, to sort of take back our communities, to take control, and to sort of, to have a liberation-oriented politics. And so as we think about the role of HBCUs, the first thing we say, like HBCUs like create a pipeline of very talented Black people, right? And who accomplish many things in the world. And so to have cooperatives linked to that to that process is important, right? And they've always, and in addition to that, they also have always been part of movements. Black students have always been part of movements. HBCUs have always been part of community economic development. And so the question is like, how does co-ops fit in that? And so in our clinic at UBC, I completely focused the clinic on cooperatives, right? So a lot of students, so because we have this sort of social justice, public interest sort of mission at David A. Clark School of Law, sometimes you think social justice, like that has nothing to do with sort of business law, right? That doesn't have anything to do with sort of transactional lawyering, which, those of us who are doing cooperatives know like completely that, you need to know something about business lawyering. And so they come into the clinic sort of wanting to take a transactional course because, our curriculum is a little light on some of the traditional sort of, securities law, corporate tax, those sorts of things. So they were like, okay, I want to get experience in what does it mean to, do a business. So I'm going to take this community economic development clinic. Some law schools have like small business clinics and those sorts of things. But Professor Howes, who started this clinic, wanted to really focus on like what does it mean to do community development. And so in our clinic, we essentially, DC has a Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which allows tenants to buy their buildings. And so we focus on those, right? We focus on the process of how do we support tenants to to form a tenant association? How do we support them with the process of negotiating their contract? How do we support them with the process if they decide to form a housing cooperative? How do we support them with the process of sort of debt financing, right? And so all of those are like really sort of kind of transactional sort of things, but it's also at the core of what we have to think about as we create cooperatives, right? Like all of those issues sort of are cooperatives. And so, so for our clinic, sort of the idea of like how do we engage with sort of cooperatives is apparent and clear. But DC is kind of unique, right? You know, like not everywhere has this sort of TOPA law, which creates this sort of pipeline of people interested in sort of, or even thinking about like I can buy my building as a housing co-op. And so I don't know exactly how do we sort of take that to other places, but I do, like for us, it's sort of apparent that we need to be there because, you know, many of these tenant associations don't have enough lawyers, one. Two, they don't have enough people who can do sort of the underwriting for these deals so that, you know, the banks can say like, oh, like you look like you can buy your building. We need more of those type of buildings because unfortunately, like some of the, I guess the first generation of people who worked with these projects are sort of retiring and, you know, not enough of us have sort of filled back into that space. So for us, the role of sort of teaching about cooperatives is an imperative for the DC environment.
Well, I just appreciated the history introduction and just want to step back and think a little bit about also the history of HBCUs and the role that they have played in the Black community since their founding beginning in the 19th century. And I heard so much over the past few days that was so inspiring, thinking about these questions that Carmen and Gary put together. And one of the things that really resonated was someone, I can't even remember who now, but someone talked about spaces we own and places we should own, places we control. And HBCUs are one of those places. And students go to HBCUs. I mean, we could ask this young woman right here. They go to HBCUs, particularly Black and brown students, seeking those spaces because they are that space that is Black owned, Black led. You know, in 2012, there was a big study done about HBCUs, and one of the conclusions that's always struck me is that HBCU students place a higher value on community service, community leadership, civic engagement, and public interest. And as Jerome said, these are the places where Black leadership is developed, right? We all teach in law schools. Those students are going on to be lawyers, but they're also, we know that's where Black political leadership comes from, Black business leadership in many ways. And so it seems like a natural fit for these HBCU law schools. And there's only 6 of them in the whole country. So I want to emphasize we don't have to limit the conversation to HBCU law schools, although it could start there. I mean, obviously Carmen and the brother here, they're not at an HBCU law school. Our sisters at UIC from yesterday, that's not an HBCU law school. But there are people in these law schools all across the country committed to doing this kind of anti-capitalist racial justice work. And so we can really model it. And just on the real specific, and I appreciate it, you get to go last so you get to comment on other people's points. I mean, I really appreciate what you said, Jerome, about DC. You know, Florida is not a welcoming or creative or innovative place, you know, with the legal infrastructure for co-ops. It's gonna be a much harder lift for folks in our community, but it can be done. And so some of the things, so I teach it, we have a brand new clinic at FAMU. It's called an economic justice clinic. We used to have a community development clinic many years ago. It was more of a traditional kind of business startup, entrepreneur, nonprofit. There's still some of that, but we're really looking to move the economic justice clinic more to work that specifically focuses on addressing the racial wealth gap. And this model and everything we've heard this week is all about that. So students in those clinics, as you know, can provide direct legal support. One of the things that we can also do, and we've done this at FAMU, is kind of research, outreach, public education. That's a piece that that can be really valuable. And because of the, the connections that the university has in community, that's an opportunity to reach more broadly.
Ebony or Jerome, do you want to respond, or do you want to open it up? I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments based on that first set of questions, but we're opening up the space.
I'll just project if I can, and I commend you all for being there. But to John's point, when we started the cooperative, it was from distress, the 2020 Farmers Cooperative. And one of the things, and this is not slamming, this is just putting the actions out there from what actually happens. Our headquarters is in Nathalie, Virginia. I actually live in Gary, Indiana, and things. But my whole point with how can HBCUs assist us? I'm not sure. How can HBCUs assist us? Now, over the last 3 years, when we founded ourselves, one of the first things we did was said we have to connect to the HBCUs and we have to cross the Mason-Dixon line. Why is that? Because the Federation, established many years ago, was very concentrated, remains concentrated, and has not crossed the Mason-Dixon line, but you had a number of black farmers, people who grew up in the South, black farmers migrated to the cities. Hence, we've got an issue with air property. And I want to encourage all of you all right now, because we are really trying to collaborate. When I say we, the 2020 Farmers Cooperative is really trying to collaborate with our HBCU law schools through the Policy Research Center, which is at Alcorn State, and doing some outreach with air property. And so what we're having is a mass exodus of land ownership by black families, because you have poachers, that's what I call them, poachers out there that are coming through. So number one, we have an MOU with UDC, Dr. Mason, and I'm thinking Dr. Mason is now coming to the law school in some capacity, this, that, and the other. We work with FAMU, we work with LSU. So here's the issue that we have. Because we have to work with these land bank institutions via the FSAs or these extension offices, we aren't getting a connection to what we feel. And because I'm the volunteering executive director, I think very differently from somebody just stepping in here. My background is in finance, the whole works. So when I think business, I'm like, okay, this is what we need. So we need access to you, the law school, and the students. And the reason I say the students is because these farmers, when you're talking about something as simple as air property, they don't know how to go to the computer and do the research to see how it's titled. They don't understand at all. They don't understand air property. So even if it's a matter of partnering with us, and there are grants out there, so I really would like to talk to you, because the Policy Research Center, they're in Texas right now doing what they call training for these farm service agencies to go out and talk to people. And I'm like, you can't just go out and talk to people about something as critical as air property. It's like I do estate planning in the discussion, but when we get down to the nitty gritty, I call my legal contacts that come and sit with me, with my clients, to talk about estate planning. It's a legal issue, and you can't have what I consider to be individuals who are learning through a little certification course to talk with somebody about that. So students, for wherever we can get to, who have access through these clinics or work in these clinics, even if they can volunteer. Now, when we wrote our grants, we're willing to pay them stipends for this, because that's what the Policy Research Center said, based on what we submitted should do. But it's having somebody sit down without, can I afford this $2,500 or this $250 an hour or $500 an hour to sit down and talk with this attorney, because, I want to keep the family homestead, and my brother over here who never paid the taxes is willing to sell it to this man over here for little or nothing, and he just has to have a little share, and once he gets to, because families were a lot bigger back then. So my whole point is you can help us by extending to us, being open to work with us, being open to not ghosting us. And so it's a matter of, we're reaching out, however we can figure out how to make it happen, commit to it. And that's what I talk about when I talk about cooperatives. It's, first of all, it's having a consciousness, but then a commitment. And so if you pick up the phone and say, hey, 2020, I hear you all are doing this, my expectation is that there's a level of commitment. And based upon that, we'll figure out, the commitment could be as small as it could be. Maybe we got 1 hour, maybe I got some direction you can say, but make the commitment and stick to it. So my whole thing is make the commitment, stick to it, and let's see, take baby steps. Take baby steps, but we need, as black farmers, we need you. That's all I can say. We need you, and I'm not opposed. It seemed to move a little bit faster when I reach out to UIC or someone and said, I need you to do this. But the money for the grants go to the land bank, not a UIC, but they have more money, more access, and the whole academia type thing. So just commit to us.
I just want to say we're actually working on an heirs property project in Eatonville, Florida, home birthplace of Zora Neale Hurston, which is being squeezed by gentrification. And the community reached out to the law school and said, can you help us? And this is exactly what you described is a model that we have, to have students doing the research. There's a community development organization that was able to get a grant to give those students some small stipends. And the students have, in partnership with the community group, done community outreach and education, basic, what is heirs property, how do you know if you have it? And that, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is it's almost like a low-hanging fruit for a law school clinic to get engaged in. And so I'd love to keep talking with you.
Okay.
I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Yes, but
We'll cover you after she does.
Okay, good.
no, I was going to say, I know that y'all need us. That's why I'm doing this work. And so actually the Ag Law Institute is very new at Southern. My first day on the job was June 1st. And coming from the Federation, I know, I was a land retention attorney. I was fielding those phone calls. I know the need. That's why I'm excited to be at Southern, because I know I need to train the next generation of attorneys to go into this area. It's not a very popular area. A lot of people don't know about it, but it's needed. I know what people are facing in these rural areas when they go, into land record divisions, or when they're looking for attorneys in those areas and they don't have anyone to help them. And so it's my goal. I am committed. That's why I'm doing this work. So I would really love to stay in contact with you and see how we can work with you.
I was going to ask you the same thing. How do we reach out and how do we stay in contact? Because we're from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We don't have like the HBCUs in our network, but I have family members in our network, and I have reached out to them, but they weren't connected to law, right? Like my one niece, she's going to doctor, and my sister graduated from Smith, so she's doing something else. So how do we, as cooperative mind and Friables and so on, how do we connect to your network? And we just left Atlanta like 3 weeks ago, so we learned about the Southern, the organization that you belong to. But like I said, we're kind of, in Pittsburgh, we're kind of stuck with like what we have, which is Caucasian lawyers, and they don't understand our needs. In particular, it also connects back to the civil rights and the little things that people aren't really getting their justice around, like say the land. And I always always said, well, it sounds like this is a civil rights infringement, and they'll tell us that, well, you know, this is the law, you know, like, the law is colorblind, more or less. And another thing with our universities, their students, like the University of Pittsburgh, they'll tell us, oh, well, the students, they only can observe. They only, and I'm like, well, and we don't have money to pay lawyers like that, or we wouldn't even be trying to connect with a law school, you know, or a clinic. And I know, are you familiar with Derek Bell? He was a lawyer for Harvard. Now, they have the Derek
University of
Bell
Pittsburgh first.
law,
University
yeah,
of
over
Pittsburgh.
there. And I'm like, now I know if Derek Bell was still living, this would not be going on. It's almost like his, under Pitt, the center's just there in name of him. So I wanna be connected as much as possible, and, you know, I would appreciate how, you know, you guys can become a cooperative in yourself as Black lawyers in the future for our future.
The one thing I'm sort of thinking about, and I think sort of all the work that we're talking about is important. The sort of challenge that I find with my institution is sort of a capacity challenge, and I imagine that's a sort of similar capacity that we all face in sort of community groups. So like I said, I direct myself. I get 6 students where I'm essentially sort of taking through the process and sort of throwing them into these projects. You know, and you know, as you know, like the first 3 months that you work with a staff person is like probably their most, you know, like the bumpy time, and then after that 3 months, you know, like they're sort of a bit more stabilized. But then, you know, in our clinic, they often sort of, they're gone after that 3 months. And so I'm one of the things, and I would like to, you know, I know Carmen, I feel like Carmen has really sort of overcome this, you know, with some of your work. It's just like, how do we sort of overcome from the clinic side, the sort of capacity gap? Because in order for us to expand the work that we do, we need to just expand how many sort of attorneys we have, you know, that sort of thing, to sort of, to do the work, so.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, the American Bar Association is currently considering, whether law schools should require more experiential credits in order for students to graduate, which obviously I think is an excellent idea. I think one of the, great things about the law school that I work at, CUNY Law, is that every single student has to take clinic. And every clinic experience runs from 10 to 16 credits. So we get them full-time, almost, for a semester or for a year. And that really helps in terms of being able to do more work, and we have like 6 hours of instructional time, and it just really helps get students up to speed and be able to assume the role of attorney, obviously under our supervision, and we check all the work and make sure the work is being done well, but also talking about approaches, and I'm sorry, I don't remember your name. But Carol, in terms of also teaching them theoretical perspectives. Some folks are from the community, some students are not from the community, and really trying to give and provide a sense of what it means to work in communities that are not your own community. And even when it is your community, not to oversubscribe, and just to be really thoughtful and intentional about taking the lead from the people who are doing the work and the people who are most directly impacted. So I think that reaching out to law schools, and their clinical programs in particular, because that's the design, and it is where they have to do and not just observe. And also, if you reach out to a school and they don't have the capacity, I was talking to someone in the hallway, and we've done this a lot at CUNY. You know, as attorneys, we can only practice in the jurisdiction in which we're licensed. But sometimes people will reach out to us, and what we will say is, okay, if you find us local counsel, local attorney to work with, we'll work with them. And we're even willing to like do all the work and have someone else sign off on it, because it's not about our ego. It's about sharing the resources. So it's really a luxury for us. not to say that it's not a lot of work, but it's really a luxury for us in terms of the amount of time that we have with students and how we can work with students and community and have our students learn directly from the community as well and not just us.
The cooperative model and that kind of, and all the stuff we've been talking about this week into the law schools. We not only have the students for the 6 months or 3 months during the clinic, but we're training them to do this work when they graduate and go out, and there will be lawyers in your community who have hopefully had this training, been in these clinics. So we're also building the capacity generally of these black and brown social justice lawyers that are coming out to do this work. And that's, there's been a lot of talk this week about intergenerational, and that's another piece when I think about the role that the HBCUs can play, is we're a bridge to that intergenerational opportunity, both in training these law students, but also these are students who are going to, who will be able to be involved in co-ops and be part of them and lead them and develop them. So that's another aspect of it that gives me hope.
I just want to speak to that as well as, as maybe we look at the law schools as the capacity builders, as they're building this core of legal cooperators who are getting trained up, getting the experiential experience, possibly connecting back to their hometowns through their clinic, working with the local lawyer, because they're going to go back to that place. So it still has a potential having a place-based approach, but still also connecting with the community that they're in. And I think that's important in connecting to students, but then as we have this pipeline. So we have this commitment here on stage already, because they're already doing the work around co-ops. So we have these pipeline builders. So how do we get the other schools involved? How do we get the extensions involved to be an extension of the work, to add capacity to some of the business and technical assistance, to add capacity in bringing awareness to the campuses as well as they're doing this work. So I just wanted to add that on as possibly a solution going forward, possibly an option going forward, and how we can do that. And I'm taking notes as, we have to figure out a way to make it easy for you all to connect and find them. So is that something that we're going to have to look at as a takeaway from this? How do we make it easy for the people in the room within the ecosystem to connect to them without having to chase down the pages within a website, you know what I mean, to get to them? So that's something that hopefully we can bring out of this as well.
Can I just make one suggestion? This thing called technology is a beautiful thing, and it's something that we did all last year, and we just brought, our attorney speaking. I would love for you all to come and speak on one of our sessions about whatever you want to speak about, if it's cooperative, but the legal, because there's sometimes, at least with black farmers, a little bit of inhibition about speaking to an attorney. But when they're on that technology type thing, some of the questions that they will ask, it hits home, and they're really trying to get free advice, but it just helps to have that access. So technology, if you're willing to, do a legal law session or something, we call them, a whole lot of catchy things to bring folk in. Technology works well. And, I'm very quick on a session to tell them it's important that you reach out to a local legal entity to continue the discussion. But just to have the black representation, the farmers just go crazy.
So to make a real honest comment, I think for me, one of my biggest challenges is getting the students interested in this area of the law. And so it's my understanding that at the law school currently they do have a new ag law society, but it's not the students of color who are interested. I think everyone in this room knows that, just the history of ag in this country and how hard farming is. A lot of families have told their youth not to go into farming. A lot of young people, they think it's slavery or slave work, like they don't wanna go into ag. And so I know I have work to do in getting them interested, but, ag law touches everything under the sun. As we've said, it's business law, it's contracts, it's estate planning, it's, property law. I mean, everything touches ag, so it's really getting them interested, and I know that our farmers want to see Black lawyers doing this work. Again, coming from the Federation, there was a lot of white attorneys who wanted to come and volunteer and work with us, but from what we hear from the farmers, just because of things that have happened historically, is that they don't want to work with them. And so it's really getting our youth engaged and wanting to go into this area of the law. What that means when you don't have access to healthy food, sustainability, growing our own food, just the prices of food, just the ripple effects in terms of deprivation when we're not involved in control over our own nourishment is also something that we should underscore, because a lot of times we know the legal aspects, but also kind of reminding our students of why we're doing the work and why it's impactful and why it's needed.
Yeah, maybe I could share here. I always have this sort of question, right? Because like a lot of sort of activists who do work around food are like food sovereignty, food and land sovereignty, and I'm like, aren't we just talking about farming? And they're like, and for me, it's always been this sort of like, isn't this just farming? But just to share a personal story, so my grandfather took all of our extended family out, whether in the summers to go work, for a white guy on his farm, right? And so we'd have to sort of pick, and then sort of the families would sort of divide up based upon how many, pecans were picked up or how many strawberries were picked. That family would get that money, and then we had sort of a system where, depending on who you rode with, you would have to pay that, and we often thought the person who we rode with was exploiting us, in terms of how much money they were getting, and all that sort of thing. But we would be out in the sun, right? Like sun similar to out here, doing this work on land that we didn't own, right? And so the meanings that we were making from that, like my family member, I ain't going out to farm on anyone's farm anymore. I'm not doing that type of work. And so for me, that sort of thinking about that sort of helped me to fill the gap of why we need to sort of read how we talk about it, how we talk about the land, how we talk about food. Because I think some people have those memories of not owning the land. Like some people own the land, but a lot of people didn't own the land and did this kind of work as sharecroppers. They have those memories, sort of those hurts, those pains, those losses embedded in them. And so, yeah, so for me, it's sort of that process of thinking about, okay, this is why we're talking about this differently. And this is why we sort of are, creating new political meaning and sort of connecting it to our struggles, right? And so, I don't know, just a thought.
So I'm seeing a lot of overlap here, not only in what we're discussing, but in my life, and it's kind of like, oh my God. So just a little background. 12 years ago, my husband and I started Show Fresh Sustainable Foods in New Orleans because we were growing food in our yard in the city, so we don't have a farm out in one of the other parishes. But we grew to the extent that it was too much for us and our little kids at the time, and we gave it to people and we started selling it. And it's still ongoing, and he just finished his sale today on Bayou Road. On top of that, I have a background in healthcare administration, and I have a tour guide company in which I talk about the Black history in the historic neighborhoods of New Orleans, because New Orleans wouldn't be what it is without Black people doing things. But that's not the history you get told when you come to the airport with the little flyers. So I'm looking at all the overlap here, recognizing that New Orleans has 3 HBCUs. None of them have a law school associated with them, but Southern is right down the street in Baton Rouge. and I'm looking at how could those HBCUs create cooperatives among themselves to serve like I know in Atlanta, like my cousin graduated from Clark Atlanta, but she was taking classes at Spelman and Morehouse, and so one thing I'm looking at as HBCUs that are in close proximity to each other. I grew up in the Philadelphia area, so I look at like Lincoln and Cheney are like 45 minutes apart from each other. Those are the first HBCUs I was introduced to. But how can they partner, because we know their resources are different than PWIs, but they could fill in the gaps for each other in the things that, hey, Xavier has this, but maybe Dillard could use that, and Suno could use that, and the community could have access to all of it to create this pipeline so young people recognize the need for it. And maybe, in New Orleans, they're not looking at agriculture, even though there's severe food apartheid there, but they can see how this cooperation will help us with the housing issue we have, the horrible public education issues that we have, the fact that I-10 destroyed the Black Wall Street of New Orleans. Looking at ways, I think, and I have to share this caveat that I graduated from a PWI and did not attend an HBCU, but lots of my family members did, and they're always talking about it. It's a big thing in our community, so I see this as an opportunity for HBCUs to cooperate more with one another, and then create those systems and opportunities so that people can benefit from those things in the ways that pertain to them.
So I want to respond to that, and yes, I agree. And being able to approach it from that regional concept of proximity is of value, but also is if we could again bring the existing law clinics together, maybe using technology, platform style, to ease the access to the information and the sharing of that knowledge and resources around a cooperative approach, but yet is advance that down into the extension, because every land grant has an extension. Most of them have an R&D department, so is being able to connect with that extension to be the extension of this cooperative work. What if we're able, again, looking at over the next 10 years, there's 106, 107 HBCUs that we can actually have a community development center focusing on cooperative community development. That's not impossible, leveraging technology. Many of them do similar things or industry or sector specific things that intersect already with the cooperative ecosystem and a lot of things that take place. So how do we uplift that? How do we leverage that? And it's going to take individuals being champions. It's going to take individuals right here on the stage to help connect that, to bridge that gap that you're talking about. So there's access to that legal information in a way that those that don't have law clinics, because 6 can't serve 107, but with technology, we can build that capacity and move this pendulum forward as far as how our communities cooperate. And you're right, maybe it is this national movement around HBCUs to take on that charge and being a part of it. And it's going to come back, and we've talked about it all week, is education. It has to be part of that all the way through our continuum. So that way they understand the importance of the cooperative movement, the history of the cooperative movement. How do we get it into the classroom so that it can come out as well? But the extensions are very much front-facing with the communities, and so can very much do a lot of this heavy lifting, working with third-party agencies, et cetera, to do that. So that's a possible way that we can look at this. That's a possible takeaway, and something that I will look forward to hoping that we can move from this panel into that direction as well. She's nodding her head, so I have commitment.
Yes. I want to thank you for your comment. I'm so glad that we made this conversational because you saying that, Dillard University has the Ray Charles Food Studies program, and Zella Palmer, a good friend of mine, is the director. And because you made that comment, I hadn't even thought of it, but I'm definitely going to reach out to her and see how we can collab with each other. So, thank you.
I just want to add that I think that this relationship has to go both ways, right? So as Gary was saying, I know at our HBCU, I mean, no one is in the curriculum or is talking about cooperatives, right? And so there needs to be, I mean, I think there's a lot of informal knowledge about it, just from people's lived experiences, like Jerome was saying, and so I think in order to maximize the resource that these law students and law schools and just undergrad campuses can bring, there needs to be more of that information, just like we got all this week, for those students. And I think it would help them not only be able to provide these critical legal services, but also to be part of the movement more broadly.
So with this, I'd like to uplift at the law clinics with their experiential sessions, add the reading of Collective Courage to help uplift that and support that if possible. So, I mean, it might be a small lift, but I think that would be something of value as you speak and say it.
So it's interesting because we start from like the technical details. Students want to know what is the technical law, and I want to know how this builds my skill. And then we actually then move to what does this mean in terms from a theory of change? Like what does it mean for these sorts of things for people to be able to control their buildings, right? And how should we think about that? How should we understand that within the context of a broader set of things? So we actually read Collective Courage. I don't know if we had time, but I tried to build in sort of the narrative of and try to use the sort of grounded experience of actually working with people. We're going into someone's co-op, supporting their board governance, and they're there's this guy sleeping in our basement. Do we throw them out? But then do we throw out the person that they're attached with, right? They're dealing with these challenges and thinking about, and so the students come back and sort of thinking about should we call the police, or should we what's our role in that? And so they get to think about these sort of they get to think about abolition. They get to think about in sort of a very grounded context where it affects someone's lives. They get to think about what does it mean for people to democratically sort of control their space, which is what I think is so sort of important and beautiful about working with sort of in the housing co-op space in DC. People get to control and own their lives. But we sort of do it from rather than doing sort of the theory first, we actually do the work first, and then use that to sort of build the reflection out over the course of the semester around what does this mean more generally.
Yeah, and I think I'm sure all the Carmen and others who do this work, the clinical model is built around client-centered, community-led lawyering. It's the model that it's based on, and all the clinics are based on providing legal resources to underserved communities. And so there's a foundation in the pedagogical model that connects directly to the cooperative model.
I just wanted to ask your opinion on in my opinion, blatantly discriminatory legislation that's being proposed in Florida, and Ron DeSantis plans to run for president in 2024 after proposing said legislation.
Well, we could have another whole, first let me just say, what's happening in Florida politically is nightmarish. A lot of those laws are being challenged. A lot of them will be struck down. They've lost in a bunch of cases already. Doesn't matter, right? They're not really doing it to actually make the change. They're doing it for political capital. And then I'll also say, this is not in defense of Florida, but this what's happening in Florida, you know, we're the canary in the coal mine, right? So it's coming to a state house near you in the next weeks, months, and you know, but I think I really appreciate the question, because all this week as I was listening to a lot of the discussion about the movement, how it's developed to create this independent source of economic and political power, the talk about the backlash, that's what's happening politically in Florida, right? You know, and so you know, they're taking books out of the schools. You can't talk about Black history. You can't talk about the kind of struggles that Gary started us off with, and the struggles that rose up out of that. And that's part of the backlash as well. It's erasing this history, and you know, we're a state university, and I can tell you that the law school is, you know, absolutely committed to the struggle for racial justice. No professor I know has changed anything they talk about critical race theory. I mean, we're an HBCU law school. We are critical race theory. But you know, at the higher levels, at the administrative levels, the bullying is working, right? People are afraid, and they're afraid particularly of getting the funding cut, right? That's really what the Board of Governors, and that's their threat. If you don't toe the line, we're going to cut resources. And as we all know, HBCUs are already systematically under-resourced from the beginning. So University of Florida, they have a multi-billion-dollar endowment. Some funding cut from the state is not really going to change anything.
Right.
At Florida A&M, you know, a 10% budget cut means people get fired, classes are canceled, scholarships are lost. I mean, it really is an attack on Black liberation through education, right? It's the 21st century version of you can't teach slaves to read, and that's what's happening. And we have to be standing forward against that. I didn't mean to soapbox there, sorry.
Excuse me, can I ask a question? Because I've honestly been very patient trying to get a question answered. First of all, I wanted to touch on what the sister said, that it's the government's job to house our people. It's not our job. But the government is not living up to its responsibility to house our people. It's forcing all of us to do it, and so that's why I agree that we all should be housing developers. I don't care if we're universities, pinochle clubs, it doesn't make a difference, because we're in a true crisis. So I want to mention that. I also wanted to ask questions, but I wanted you to think about as you answer that question. And I say again, I'm very proud to be in the presence of lawyers, and that's why I'm trying to get some free legal advice. Because you know, we as oppressed people, whether it's the Cherokee Nation and the we've always, whether it's Drew Plessy versus Ferguson, whatever, we're always coming to the courts for justice, because a lot of places we couldn't get it anywhere else. And a lot of times we didn't get it there either. So I hope you answer this question, not answering me, but answering the historic Hill District, which produced August Wilson, which produced Derek Bell, who's from a working class family from the Hill District, which produced the Pittsburgh Courier. If you want a little bit more history on the Hill District of Pittsburgh, how much we all owe it, it reads Smoketown by Mark Whitaker, who put us second to the Harlem Renaissance for its contribution to Black America. So what we're trying to do at the Hill District Consensus Group, because we believe Black excellence is in the soil of the Hill District. And so when I ask this question, I hope you think about that and what we're trying to bring back. So we're thinking about how do you, in the sense of Franklin Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights, which he said we have a right to a decent job, we have a right to a home, which my interpretation would mean you have a constitutional right to a home, and if you didn't get that, you could sue the government. So right now in a lot of our areas, we have these so-called progressives that are being elected to office. I question if it's around what we've seen around police reform since George Floyd, which we've seen none. but we have elected these progressives to office. So I'm asking you, how do we codify the right to a home in the city? How do we codify the right to the city? Because we've seen mass displacement of African Americans from all over urban areas of America. I know it's a tough question. So again, housing is a human right. How do we codify that? And again, how do we codify almost like reparative legislation, as the sister talked about, what happened with these roads, and that's happened in every major city in this country. And in Pittsburgh, we got a double whammy. We got that. We also got the destruction of about a third of the Lower Heel, which was like our Black Wall Street, to build a civic arena. So my question is, what can we actually take to our new so-called progressive mayor, who's our first African American mayor, and put in front of him and say, we need you to push this legislation that will in the end lead to a right to housing for our citizens in the city of Pittsburgh.
So, I mean, I would just start from, and we would love to have anyone else jump in here, just sort of thinking about the model that DC has done, right, around TOBA. I'm really excited about this law that, giving, tenants a right to buy their building so that investors, can't, buy up everything, right? And I think that's important to at least stopping the process. It doesn't always work like we want, right? Because sometimes rather than buying their building, they assign their rights, but then they sort of, come to sort of an agreement about like how much rents are gonna be and those sorts of things. And so I think that model is important. What I'm hesitant about is I'm not certain how many cities have the political will to put that in place against sort of the real estate, developer, everyday, people who might own a couple of properties sort of group coalition.
But brother, that hits somebody who's trying to sell, like what happened to me, where the owner decided, hey, I can get Whole Foods to move here. But what about those people who are raising rents in a neighborhood and say, hey, we gotta do repairs, you gotta get out, of course they raise them. So that hits very few people that at least in Pittsburgh, we don't see major, but we're talking about that every day. Because gentrification happens apartment by apartment, house by house. It doesn't happen like what happened to me.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think about a lot, sorry.
And I won't interrupt you again.
The other thing I think about a lot is like sort of this conversation about co-ops is,
I know it's not.
like if we take just policies, right, like low-income housing tax credits, I think a lot about like low-income housing tax credit builds this affordable housing, and it's really it's the primary way that affordable housing is built. Most of us probably think HUD, but really through tax policy, through this IRC section 42, low-income housing tax credit is how most of the affordable housing is built. But in its project formation, it actually creates restrictions from having things like housing co-ops, right? Which is a way that we could sort of control the house that's built, right? It does allow at year 15, tenants could potentially buy it if it's sort of built into the contract. But by that point, you need to get more money to do renovations and all these sorts of things. So like for us, advocacy around putting co-ops into every law that has some benefits is important and necessary. So like low-income housing tax credits. The other part of that is making sure that we can sort of, as communities, can invest in these projects, so we can sort of offset sort of the traditional investor class for these type of projects. So we that's something that we can think about, and that has to be sort of that has to come out of sort of spaces like this, because I look at these laws and just see how they sort of evolve, and they evolve based upon the interests of traditional investors and not necessarily based upon community economic development groups and groups that represent co-ops and such, things like that. So I think that's another way that we can sort of think about sort of the pushback and enabling us to sort of take back control. And that's sort of I think about it at the federal policy level, but other people think about it at the, throughout this conference at the local level, like the role of sort of local policies to do that as well.
So I don't really have have an answer, but I'll say as someone who has served, so I was in the Louisiana House of Representatives, and so I was someone who went in very naive, you know, I'm about to be an agent of change, and, you know, I'm filing marijuana bills, cause in Louisiana, everything from 0 to 60 pounds was treated the same, and so, you know, you get caught with a joint your second time, now you a convicted felon, you know, facing, we had someone literally in jail serving life. You know, especially in a time where, you know, Colorado had legalized it and they're making all this money. So anyways, my point is, even when you have someone who is progressive, because that's what I kept hearing, oh, you know, you too progressive, you ahead of your time, because remember now, I'm in Louisiana. So sometimes you have to remember that even if you have a progressive person who is in there, you have to remember what they're facing, like they're one person. And so you alone can't do it. And so if all of your colleagues are being bought and sold by industry, there's only so much you can do with your one vote. And a lot of times, you know, it's a well-oiled machine, it's doing exactly what it wants. Oftentimes, those of us who are the progressive people, who are there to represent the people, you don't get the same kind of funding and campaign donations because you're not doing the will of, you know, the people who have the money. So it's a really tricky situation, and so sometimes you can go there and you can want to make all these great changes, but people like me, you don't really tend to last long if you're not playing the game. So I was a one term and done. They made sure that I was not returning.
I know what you mean. I was a former elected official in Pittsburgh. I know exactly.
Yeah,
So only because of it, in the interest of time, and I think we have like 2 minutes, but one of the beautiful things is that a lot of the questions that we had planned to ask came through you. So we did reach a lot of that. And one of them was actually, you know, how do and can HBCU law schools champion bringing awareness to the history, legacy, and the power of co-ops, both past and present, in the Black community. And some of the comments that we heard earlier made me think how important it is for us not to have our history erased, our work invisibilized, and the importance of documenting our work and archiving our work, and even thinking about like the National Cooperative Bank and Ron sharing earlier how that came to be from racial justice organizing, and it only came to awareness in the last couple of years. So there's a part where we have to do this work together, and we have to sustain the work and sustain the knowledge and keep it moving forward, and not that it becomes stale. But I'm gonna start talking really fast. I am a New Yorker. We are really interested and wanted to gauge the interest of this group in forming a coalition and working together to build a national campaign policy effort to move this work forward. So maybe what we can do is, you know, about a piece of paper, and folks can sign up if they're interested, and then we can continue the conversation that way.
Just kind of real quick with a show of hands, just let me see who's in here would be interested in being part of a national policy coalition.
I have one comment.
We didn't hear. Please repeat.
Yeah, so as Carmen was speaking, is the interest of individuals up here, but also we want to gauge in a room. We're going to put out a piece of paper, she said, so we can collect, but just raise your hand if you have an interest in being a part of a coalition to explore national policy, to develop national cooperative policy around the work that we're doing. Thank you, appreciate it. So, I
have one comment, and it's to, I forget your name.
Yeah.
And you said the students weren't interested in that.
Oh, you mean Ebony?
Yeah, Evan. I think maybe because going back to the sister and the farming, maybe you should have a different curriculum, which is movement lawyers and community lawyers. And so the community lawyers, they work directly with the groups, and the movement lawyers, they work around the injustice. So maybe you should change it, then more black students will wanna get involved. Thank you. Thank you for your comment.
All right, so we're going to close out the session. We've gone over. So we want to appreciate everybody for the participation and the engagement during this session. And I want to thank the panelists, Mark, Ebony, Jerome, and my co-moderator, not Q. Carmen. It's the same. I was going to say cutie, but just want to say thank you for the dialogue, the engagement, the conversation, and so it's been a great conference, and I think we ended it well, and just want to say thanks, and we'll pass the mic and hand the stage over.